So now it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Arunima Malik. Arunima is an associate professor in sustainability at the School of Physics and Business School at the University of Sydney. She undertakes big data modeling to quantify sustainability impacts at local, national, and global scales, and has carried out supply chain assessments of healthcare, biofuel production, construction materials, global energy use, global nitrogen and greenhouse gas emissions, and tourism. Arunima's research is interdisciplinary and focuses on the appraisal of social, economic, and environmental impact using input and output analysis. So please join me in welcoming the Arunima. And please add questions to Slido, please.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Jackie, for inviting me for speaking today. Just see if I can move my slides. Okay. So in my talk today, I'll share the work that we are doing at the University of Sydney in quantifying the environmental and social impacts embodied in international supply chains. So Tony mentioned in his talk this term, which is spillover impacts. These impacts are what we quantify in the research that we do at the University of Sydney. And we do this for various countries. And in my talk today, I'll touch on some of the work that we are doing for the EU, because there is a fair bit of interest in that region in quantifying their impacts embodied in international supply chain. I'll touch on some case studies that we've done for Australia as well. So the starting point for these impacts that we quantify in international supply chains is really consumption, which we all engage in. So consumption of goods and services in our everyday lives, be it food, electricity, resources, textile products, or the things that we see around our homes. So we sort of engage in this on a pretty regular basis. And our models that we use at the University of Sydney, they start off with this understanding that there is a final consumer, which we all are, and we desire or need or want certain things to keep us going. And that can, of course, create these impacts upstream in the supply chain, because production of food requires interactions of the food sector with other sectors of the economy, and production of electricity requires the electricity sector to interact with other sectors of the economy. So we cannot just have the electricity sector not interacting with machinery sectors or other sectors. So there's this interconnection in the economy that we sort of try to capture in the models that we develop at the University of Sydney. And this consumption perspective can be at a household level, or it can be at an industry level. So if you have the food industry or the textile industry, that industry interacts with other sectors in the economy for producing a certain good or item. It can be for a region, so taking the entire regional perspective, and at a country level as well. And we have models that we develop which capture impacts at these various scales. These dots that I have are these upstream interactions that we try and capture using our models. So starting with the final consumer, immediate suppliers, then suppliers of suppliers, suppliers of suppliers, and then so on, so that we have a supply chain tree that sort of keeps on expanding. Now, you might question, how can you actually measure all these interactions? Because you wouldn't know who is sitting in the 10th supply chain layer upstream. So how can you possibly go and gather data from all these various suppliers in the supply chain? So I'll share some of the models that we sort of work with that enable us to capture these impacts. So food demand is one example. So food is, of course, such a broad category, which can mean all sorts of things. It can mean fruits, vegetables, meat products, condiments, bread, cheese, etc. And each of these are pretty unique, and they all have their unique supply chains. Clothing, textiles, footwear, if you think about it, international supply chains produced in different countries around the world. And even with clothing, there's cotton clothing, wool clothing, polyester. So think about all the supply chains, even for the production of one single piece of item. And then, of course, upstream in various countries. And in those countries or closer to home as well, we can have these spillover impacts. And these impacts can either be environmental impacts or social impacts. And if I unpack environmental, can be greenhouse gas emissions, water use, land use, biodiversity impacts, material use. If I unpack social impacts, could be occupational hazards. So some of the developing countries grappling with fatal and non-fatal accidents in the supply chain. You might have heard of this fire that happened in Bangladesh in a textile factory years ago. So some of the products that were produced in that factory, of course, get consumed by consumers that are not residing in Bangladesh, but in countries worldwide. So social impacts, occupational hazards, modern slavery related impacts, which we're trying to capture in the supply chain, and other poverty related impacts in the supply chain. So these spillovers can either be negative or positive. So I don't really want to put a negative lens on the spillovers. Of course, if we are interacting in these international supply chains or getting goods and services, this globalized world, we are sort of generating positive spillovers as well, in the sense that people who are working for these industries in other countries, that's their income source, male and female employment. And the reason I actually distinguish these is because we are able to capture how many women are working in the supply chain and how many men are working in the supply chain for satisfying consumption of goods and services. So on one end, we have CO2 emissions, which can be considered, of course, a negative spillover. This person sort of sliding down the stairs, fatal, non-fatal accidents, modern slavery impacts, we categorize as negative spillovers, and some of the positive spillovers. Of course, we have more in the negative basket and not so many in the positive basket, but it is, I think, important to acknowledge those as well. And Tony showed us the Sustainable Development Goals at the University of Sydney. What we're trying to do is we are trying to connect these indicators, we call these indicators, CO2 emissions or income, employment, modern slavery. We're trying to connect these indicators to the Sustainable Development Goals. And Tony made a really good point that these Sustainable Development Goals are nationally focused. There is only really one indicator, which is material footprint, which specifically considers this footprint angle, which is the impacts embodied in the supply chain. No other indicator, of course, emissions are mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals, but not from a spillover perspective, not from an upstream perspective. It's primarily nationally focused. It's only the material footprint indicator which it takes the footprint perspective or the upstream perspective. This image that I have on the slide is what I call an input-output matrix. So this matrix is what we work with when we are trying to quantify these impacts embodied in the supply chain. These matrices in Australia are produced by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, so how the national economy works, and countries around the world have their own input-output table. So they have their own table about how their economy works. We can put these tables together and the imports and the exports into this one big matrix, which we call multi-regional input-output table. And as the name suggests, multi-regional captures detail on more than one region. And in each of those regions, we can capture detail about different sectors. And by sector, I mean the food sector or the electricity sector or the car manufacturing sector, mining sector, depending on how the different economies are around the world, we are able to sort of capture that detail in this one big matrix and the interactions between the different sectors and the regions. So Australia's healthcare sector, for example, getting inputs from China's manufacturing sector, that is captured in this matrix. These matrices can be as big or as reasonably small to sort of work with, depending on the resolution of the region that we have and the sector that we have in these tables. The matrix that we've recently developed at the University of Sydney, just to share, considers at a high level detail on 221 countries and 6357 sectors. Of course, when you try to put these sectors and these countries in one massive matrix, it's not computationally possible yet, but the data do exist. Some countries don't have robust data measurements, so estimates. And the table that we have developed in collaboration with the UN is this GLORIA model, which is the Global Resource Input-Output Assessment Model, which has information on 164 regions and 120 sectors, and it's available online for download. So this multi-regional input-output database, for each of these if you wanted to visualize, for 164 regions stacked in the columns, 164 regions stacked in the rows, and for each of those regions, if you blow those regions out, we have 120 sectors, and all these interactions are captured in monetary terms in this matrix. This matrix can be coupled with another matrix on environmental, social, and economic data, so emissions information, water use, land use, biodiversity threats, social impacts, and that's the model that we use for quantifying spillovers. So just taking an example and unraveling this producer-consumer perspective. So we have consumers, and let's say they consume a range of items, and those impacts of their consumptions take place in countries around the world, and that is what we call these impacts that spill over in other nations, impacting the well-being of people in those countries, be it from an environmental perspective or a social perspective. So producers, consumers is what we try to connect and quantify in the supply chain. As I mentioned, we've done a fair bit of work with the EU in producing reports for different sectors. So in 2020, we worked with the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network in Paris to look at textile supply chains. Then that work led on to looking at the food supply chains. And then recently, we've looked at mineral supply chains. And this all arose from interest in the EU in wanting to look at their impacts embodied in the imports that they're getting from countries worldwide. So I thought I'll share just one case study from these reports, the textile one. So if we question how does the EU perform on social impacts driven by consumer demand for textile products, so how deep can we sort of drill down in the supply chain, as in what numbers can we put? So let's say if we pick on Germany, getting textile products from countries around the world, looking at fatal accidents as a social indicator, we can see what are the top countries that sort of pop out in our assessment and give percentages to where these impacts are taking place for consumer demand in Germany. For fatal accidents, so some examples here of the countries that come up. Non-fatal accidents, looking at Italy, for example, as a country, so we can isolate impacts by region. I haven't put sectoral detail on this graphic, just the regional detail, as in a country interacting with other countries, and then what, if we isolate just the textile sector from the model, what countries come up. Of course, our supply chains are complex. They are not just one country to another country. You can have a lot of intermediate products being traded across the world. But if you just look at the very first producer and the final consumer and the supply chains that sort of interconnect those two. For agriculture-related supply chains, we noticed from our assessment that most accidents happen in the supply chains of developing countries, and some of the sectors are listed on one slide for producers. Bangladesh, agricultural sector. You'll notice that for Bangladesh, I only have the agricultural sector, but then for China, it's actually broken down into subsectors, and you might question why. It goes down to the data resolution that we're able to get for those countries. So some challenges, of course, in the work that we do in quantifying impacts embodied in supply chains, but the resolution that we work with, some countries have better resolution data-wise than others. So most accidents happen in the supply chain of developing countries and in those upstream supply chains. So here I've zoomed it out by sector, and this is what we call a production layer decomposition graph. So we use this term production layer in the research that we do. That sort of means that every upstream layer is a production layer, because at every layer something is being produced, and these sectors interact with one another. So for EU as a whole, with all the different EU states, we can isolate the impacts for an indicator and different sectors. And then for Germany, we can isolate the impacts for different sectors and the region as well. So a bit more closer to home. So that was EU and the work that we did with the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. But of course, if we're wanting to hone in on one sector, at a national level, we have spillover impacts at a regional level as well. So sector level spillovers, we've done some work with the health system, and recently, this is freshly published, is what we say in research. So a couple of weeks ago, this came out looking at the regional impacts, carbon and waste. Western New South Wales Local Health District. They were interested in looking at their direct and indirect impacts. And if you look at the pies, the direct is fairly small, but the indirect is actually a major chunk. So that's because they actually interact with other regions in Australia and also worldwide. We just looked at the regional perspective in this case and not the international supply chains. But really for two indicators, CO2 emissions and waste, there's a fair bit of indirect impact taking place in the health sector for the goods and services that they sort of consume. And this is my final slide. So people and planet, really, these are interlinked challenges. I've only picked on the health sector here. Of course, healthcare services are critical and vital for sustaining and improving human well-being, yet they have an environmental footprint and contributes to environmental related threats to human health. So I've picked on this sector because, of course, this is one sector which we might not realize has impact that sort of create a feedback loop which comes back to the people that this sector sort of supports. And this is the work that we did with Tony a couple of years ago, where we looked at the global environmental footprint of healthcare. And on one end, we have this diagram which looks at the different indicators which we considered: greenhouse gas emissions, PM, and air pollutants, malaria risk, nitrogen and scarce water. And at the bottom, I have included a pie chart where Australia, on a per capita basis, sort of stands out in terms of the PM impacts or the footprint that we cause in other countries around the world for our consumption of goods and services, just for this one sector, which is healthcare. So really, people and planet, they're interconnected. And if we're talking about the well-being of people, we need to look at the well-being of the planet as well. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.